think that we can start. And once again, thank you all for actually being here on the first Talking Mind event. This is my conversation with Petar Velickovic. He's a research scientist at DeepMind. He finished also his PhD in computer science from University of Cambridge, obtained under the supervision of Professor Pietro Liò. His research actually interests involved in devising neural network architecture that operate on non-trivially structured data such as graphs, and different kinds of application in algorithmic reasoning and computational biology. In particular, Petar is one of the first authors, or actually first author of graph attention networks, a new popular convolutional layer for graphs. I need to say that this event is actually powered by Serbian AI Society, a new organization with a mission to be a global influencer for scientific advances, discoveries that boost innovation in the domain of AI, and an organization that wants to help the development of our future society. If you like this conversation, please just follow me on LinkedIn or on Facebook. Peter, I think that this event so far actually is pretty interesting for our participants. We got tons of questions. And actually, I will start our conversation with one quote. A quote from Blaise Pascal, who said, "All of our reasoning ends in surrender to feeling." Today, if we are talking about intelligence and the reasoning, there are a lot of questions. Are we going in the right direction? What is actually intelligence, etc.? And your topic of research is actually focusing on algorithmic reasoning. What does actually reasoning mean for you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Jovan, and it is a great pleasure to be talking to all of you today. I think that's a very interesting question. I think the concept of reasoning is something that can have 100 different definitions if you ask 100 different people, and I feel like anything I say on questions like these is bound to upset some people in the audience. But I will try to give my very personal view of how we can imagine reasoning from the point of view of my research. So specifically, I guess I look at things from a little bit more of a low-level engineering point of view, where we have these very established machine learning models, such as neural networks on one side, that are capable of coping with these tasks that are very, very challenging for classical reasoning procedures to solve. We as humans, we can recognize a certain animal when we see it immediately, but if somebody asks you to write down a set of rules for how you've actually concluded that what you're looking at right now is a dog or a cat, you probably wouldn't be able to give me a specific set of rules with which you've concluded this. And this means that it's super tricky for us to write down this reasoning as part of something that's interpretable, something like a program that we can reason about. So neural nets seem to excel in these kinds of settings where I can just show you a huge amount of instances of certain kinds of data and then ask you a question about that data. And it seems to be really good at separating out the noise and figuring out what are the key elements, but it obviously has the problem of it cannot really nicely, robustly adapt, in the sense that if I give you now a picture that drastically escapes the distribution that I've shown you during training, you're not going to be able to robustly answer that question for me. And also, if I ask the neural network to explain to me why did it make the decision it made, it's very likely going to be quite challenging to interpret the decision. On the other side, the way in which we solved problems prior to the advent of neural networks is with these classical algorithms, things like finding shortest paths or finding spanning trees or things like this. Basically things that we can very accurately reason about because the data is in a very clean form and there is no noise that we have to deal with. So if we assume that our data is in this super nice specification, then we can actually write down a very clear set of rules that helps us, for example, determine the shortest path in a particular input graph. So as a very stark contrast, we have these algorithms on one side that are very robust, very interpretable. I give you an input that's twice as big as the ones you've used when you came up with the algorithm, and the algorithm is still going to work perfectly. So in this sense, algorithmic reasoning has this very explicit steps that are being followed. And on the other side, you have neural networks that are the absolute opposite side of the spectrum. Like, they are not very robust. They are like, when you show them data that's vastly outside the training distribution, they're going to struggle a lot, and interpreting what they're doing is really hard. But they can excel a lot at processing raw data directly without having to do all this sort of cleaning, which loses a lot of information. So in a way, the best approach, the ultimate algorithm for learning, would combine the best of the two worlds. So if we had something that was as robust and interpretable as an algorithm, and then at the same time as noise coping and scalable as neural networks, would truly allow us to create one algorithm to rule them all. And this is how my research aims to combine this algorithmic notion of reasoning and bake it directly into neural networks.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. But when you're talking about algorithm reasoning, are you like pointing to the direction of some sense of like expert systems in the domain where you need to know from the ground point, like domain of the application in that sense, or you see it also as like a general approach to it where you can like creating on more like abstract level?
Yeah, so I would say that ultimately the approach would have to be general. Like, you will want to just bake in the right kinds of reasoning that humans have been historically good at, put that right into your neural network, and this will be something that maybe in a generic sense will allow your computations to become more interpretable and more robust. So like, I guess the big aim of this entire research direction I'm going in is to become able to model really hard, really challenging tasks and like transfer across many really challenging tasks, but in a way that when I ask you to explain your decision to me, you're going to be able to do so in a way that I can interpret, which I think is extremely critical for some of the applications we're trying to plug neural networks in, such as computational medicine or self-driving vehicles.
Yeah, explainable AI, especially like in domains of healthcare, is something that's, I would say, is a missing point today. There are a bunch of like use cases where companies like institutes are struggling to find like ways how to deploy some classical, I would say, deep learning. But problem is how to be really sure was the right decision that algorithm will make. And how you see actually that your domain of research is actually changing those kind of rules or that kind of situation that we have currently?
Well, I mean, in the short run, we are basically just asking a much simpler question. Like, we know that there exist these very interpretable ways of reasoning that humans have been good at prior to the invention of neural networks and like their real widespread use. And now we're just asking the question, can our existing neural networks arsenal model this kind of reasoning? Like, do we even have a fighting chance in this sense? And our results currently indicate that if we're very careful on how we set up the neural networks and how we give the data to them, they are actually able to reason robustly like an algorithm. But I feel like the constraints we're pushing on them currently almost feel a bit unnatural at times. And as a result, I feel like we need a bit more architectural progress before we can truly use this to break into the explainable AI field. But I think that we definitely have a lot of supporting evidence that modeling like this is going to be a thing of the future.
And can you share some kind of examples? Like, I'm really curious, like what's the level of reasoning? Again, okay, when you say currently, okay, you are able to do it in some level, what does it mean? Like actually on some example in the real life?
I see. So, well, we are currently able to model the kinds of computation that you might find in shortest path finding or maximum flow computations. So say if you want to do computations like the optimal capacity of a power grid, or if you wanted to compute the best way to go from point A to point B, we're currently able to imitate the kind of reasoning steps that would allow us to do these kinds of operations in an explainable way. So I'd say that's kind of the level that we're at right now.
And the problems that you are focusing on are also maybe in the domain some computer vision elements. Where are you like discovering the ways how you are able like to I would say rationally understand, okay, what's happening on some photo, on some image, in a sense where, okay, like classical deep learning with the pattern recognition and sequencing, okay, you are able to understand the dog or like a bottle. But can you explain, okay, on one photo, or when you just like switch the context, what's happening, like a story around it?
Mm. So I think that we have deliberately moved away from that perceptual aspect, because that just, you had one problem, now you're going to have 90 problems the
Yeah.
moment you do that. So we just wanted to see, on a very abstract sense, where everything is already quite symbolic, how much can we imitate reasoning? But yes, I agree that like down the line, if we want to make interpretable decisions in the vision space, for example, we have to first get really robust at detecting what's inside a scene, and then we can run our reasoning procedure on what's on a scene. And I feel like this will be the ultimate way to kind of marry the system 1 and system 2 reasoning style arguments that, say, Yoshua Bengio has been making about how we have perception on one side, like detecting from raw pixels what's actually going on in a scene, and then actually system 2, which performs the reasoning on top of these concepts. So I feel like this would really be the holy grail, but for now we're deliberately removing perceptions from the equation because the problem is already quite hard as it is.
Definitely, I see like a bunch of like a technical challenges. If you're talking from like engineering point of view to algorithmic, I'm just curious. Okay, from the crowd that we have here right now, we have one question. Like we would like to know like a technical background of our people. You have a couple of seconds just to show us okay your experience like in machine learning world. How many years of experience do you have in it? Just also to be able to narrow our communication. And of course, if we are talking around the AI, the goal of this like a series of events will be just to open some kind of fundamental questions around AI. And what could be seen is actually, yeah, we have challenges on the points where, okay, on the one hand, we have like a classical deep learning, which is like pattern recognition, bunch of pattern recognition where that is heavily like data intensive. You need like a bunch of data to be able to like segment, okay, it's a cat or it's a dog. And on the other hand, actually, there are a lot of challenges also in the domain, of course, of engineering and infrastructure, etc. And what are your thoughts regarding like the misconceptions currently with the AI? What we can see is actually that pretty much like architectures that are currently around us are pretty much similar, if I can say like that.
Okay, so I think this is a very good question. And I feel like when it comes to misconceptions about AI, I would say that there are two opposite sides of the same coin that are both being misconcepted. So on one hand, you have people who tend to have beliefs that AI is like all powerful, or that we're very close to achieving a certain state of singularity and so on. I am not going to, I'm obviously not necessarily in a position to make like a long-term or short-term claim on how close or far away we are from AGI. But what I would say personally is that in a bit of a fundamental sense, the ways in which we're optimizing these learning models and the ways in which we're learning on them hasn't that drastically changed over the past decades, even, I would say. So there's obviously a lot of really clever tricks, really clever architectural advances that have been made, but a lot of the like really astounding results that we're seeing from deep learning nowadays happen more purely from engineering efforts and the fact that we have access to much larger quantities of data and much more compute than we had, say, in the 80s or 90s when some of these models were pioneered. So I think that's one misconception, that sometimes people tend to think that we're much closer to achieving this singularity state than we actually are. So that would be on one side. On the other side, there can also be people who are inherently way too skeptical about the progress of AI and may decide to like claim that we are only making progress on some of these toy tasks and that AI is not really seeing any application in meaningful in the meaningful real world domains. But I feel like even for them, like with the right kinds of inductive biases and the right kinds of assumptions built into your problem, AI can already become a very helpful tool in many real world problems that you may not have foreseen initially. And I assume that at some point you're going to want to talk to me about applications of GNN specifically, so I wouldn't want to foreshadow any of them. But I will just say that already AI is making very, very actionable impacts in the world of medicine, in the world of autonomous vehicles, in the world of biochemistry, like, and the list can just keep going on from there. So, like at the same time, one shouldn't be way too skeptical. Like, it's not just toy tasks. With the right assumptions, these things have been deployed at scale on many influential systems. But then at the same time, don't get too overconfident. We're not necessarily conceptually that close to a truly intelligent system than we might have been maybe a decade ago.
And what are your thoughts like regarding like the modeling currently? Like apparently like we have a bunch of narrow systems that are focusing on some specific domains of application in healthcare and biology, I know in different automotive, let's say. And what's the actually layer upon that, like a layer that should connect those kind of segments? How do you see that? Like, is that the next phase, or we need also to work more deeply like under the narrow system that we have currently? Because apparently like a bunch of like capital is invested into AI in different industries, automotive especially, but still we don't have like those kind of cars around us yet.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like with careful, at this point, something like this may already be at the stage of being mostly an engineering effort rather than rather than being something where we fundamentally need to change things. But if your vision is to come closer to a truly intelligent system, whatever that might mean, I feel like there we need a little bit more crazy ideas. I feel like right now, a lot of machine learning research seems to be taking place inside this envelope where people are making very meaningful steps and directions, and such kind of progress is important. But I feel like sometimes insufficient attention is given to the truly innovative or groundbreaking work that differs from kind of the mainstream of thoughts. So I feel like we need a little bit more crazy ideas and a little bit more ways to incorporate ideas that might have been like long forgotten and try to find meaningful ways of plugging them into AI systems. I think I'm personally an example of this because I'm trying to incorporate all these really classical algorithms that one might learn like when they're doing a basic theoretical computer science course, trying to plug them into a neural network which has a fundamentally different model of computation. But I feel like these kinds of directions that may not be immediately obvious to the current dominant paradigm of GPU-driven, parallelizable, large-scale big data research is, I think, something that we definitely might want to focus on. But if you're looking at a specific application like self-driving, I feel like we're not that far away, and I feel like it's mostly an engineering effort at this point.
And when you say like crazy ideas, do you have something like around you that inspiring you currently, like some really, interesting modeling architecture, or just like a hypothesis that are maybe interesting for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. I think as far as like recent ideas in machine learning are concerned, I found, for example, the idea of capsules to be very interesting. I found that one really tried to jump out of the basic convolutional neural networks mold that people tend to use when they're thinking of image classification task, in a way that it tries to at least somewhat explicitly account for the fact that there might be objects in the scene and that there might be some invariants respective to these objects in the scene. I think that's like off the top of my head the main example I can think of, but yeah, the fact that I cannot think of that many probably means that we need to be a little bit more crazy as a field.
Yeah, we have one interesting pool currently, like in last pool, in the first pool, actually, we have saw that maybe 76, I think, % of people are actually technical with machine learning. And yes, right now we have a really interesting question: which neural network architecture currently you see as most promising, like architectures that are inspiring? You have mentioned like Hinton and capsule networks. What do you think about like unsupervised learning in the sense of reinforcement? I know that, of course, DeepMind is pretty active in that space. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so first of all, I'd say unsupervised and reinforcement are two very distinct beasts in a way. I would start off by going through the unsupervised route because that's one I've been personally involved in. I've actually done some research in that. I really feel like, and I think also as Jan LeCun and Joshua Bengio have spoken about it several times, I think that self-supervised learning is truly going to be the future because it's really, really related in many ways as to how humans learn. So, a lot of the success stories in neural networks are centered around supervised learning. Somebody gives you a ground truth for the input that you're looking at. But for example, think about humans classifying a certain animal as a cat in real life, right? So maybe a few times when you were little, for example, your parents were standing behind you and they saw you looking at a cat and they were like, oh, that's a cat. Like, you should know that that's a cat. But in reality, an event like this only happens a handful of times during your lifetime. So in effect, you get very little data with actual labels. Somehow your brain figures out, just by looking at many similar visions of similar animals throughout your lifetime, that all of those can be unified under the same concept. And it seems to do this without any inherent supervision, without any inherent teacher standing behind you and telling you what it is that you're doing. And I think it makes sense, because if you focus on looking at data without labels, as well as the minor amount of data that actually has labels, you gain access to an outstanding wealth of data that allows you to just discover the regularities in nature. And when you discover the regularities in nature, you can much more effectively generalize to something you haven't seen at all, like in your life so far. So in that sense, I think self-supervised learning, like trying to just look at the world around you without anyone explicitly telling you what the goal is, and coming up with your own inherent goals, is going to be a very important direction for machine learning research. I will just briefly touch upon reinforcement learning, because I think that it's a very important and influential direction for a general purpose control in a dynamic environment. What I do think is that a lot of its successes so far have been in these simulated environments where you can arbitrarily restart yourself at any point in time and any point in space even, and try to reenact your decisions and see what worked best. When it comes to real life, we only ever have one life, right? You don't have the option of restarting at a certain position or replaying some of your actions. So I think that more progress is needed. I think maybe some interface between reinforcement learning and unsupervised learning would be necessary in order to truly make reinforcement learning sample efficient and like deeply applicable to problems where you cannot just randomly jump around as you please.
Yeah, here also from the crowd, we see that for them also reinforcement is maybe the most interesting type of architecture currently. But if we are talking about like a reinforcement learning, of course, I will ask you about your research and graphs, etc., where you are founder of graph attention neural networks. What's the attention in reinforcement, and how we can actually have like some kind of attention in reinforcement? There I'm talking about like a system one, where we need to trigger the system to give a reward for it, and how to know, okay, where to focus.
Yeah, so attention, I think, is a very exciting concept in machine learning nowadays. For those who are less familiar, attention is basically a concept that allows you to observe your input or some subspace of your input and make a conclusion on which parts of the input are most important to the solution that you want to compute, and then basically use that. So there's been some work, for example, with image understanding or image captioning that found that when you plug this attention mechanism inside a neural network, it's able to focus on exactly the part of the image that's necessary to describe the ground truth result. So this allows you to, at least in a bit of a soft way, discover interesting objects and concepts in a scene, which is the first important step towards modeling, say, a generic law of physics or something like that. But then once you have those objects, so attention is necessarily one part of the equation, because it's going to, or a similar style mechanism, is going to extract meaningful things from your scene. Then you need to answer a more interesting question. How do those objects in the scene interact with each other? If I move some box, is this box going to affect the life of that butterfly who is in the opposite corner of the scene? Well, probably not. But how are you going to be able to decide that if you're not explicitly factoring the relations between the objects? You're stuck in a very high-dimensional pixel modeling problem otherwise, and that's not going to be very tractable. And that's one of the many places where graphs come into play, because a lot of, say, interactions in physics can be described as interactions between pairs of entities. Like there's a force from one body acting on another body, which causes these bodies to move in a certain way, which we observe as their trajectories in space. So if you have an attention mechanism that extracts concepts and a graph neural network on top of that, that's going to find ways of meaningfully relating your concepts and then using that to simulate how the world is going to evolve, you truly have a way towards intelligently and generalizably coming up with a model of the world, much like, for example, scientists like Isaac Newton might have done.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Like, I strongly believe that point of attention is one of the crucial moments where we are narrowing actually our focus and saying to the system, okay, this is the thing where you should look at, and from this, okay, you will learn. Not to have like a general perspective, like a sequence of like focuses there. And there is one question here, like from our participants. In your area of research, how does the merge between traditional algorithms and neural networks work? Particularly, how do you include uncertainty in your domain of work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so currently we are assuming, like the way we're currently doing things is we're basically assuming that the data is attached with no noise whatsoever. So we're basically removing all the perceptual components from the learning because that raises the problem complexity. But that being said, obviously the neural networks are not perfect reasoners in this sense, and they are going to make mistakes from time to time, and there's going to be some noise involved in their predictions. So we currently sort of envision these models being applied mostly in areas where, say, a good heuristic might be required. So, for example, in many, you have this wide-ranging area of approximation algorithms, which is not designed to like find you the optimal solution to a task, which may be very intractable to compute, something like traveling salesman, but you might be able to come up with a solution that's very close or very good, something that you can still, use to heuristically answer the question in a meaningful way. And for many search problems, this is going to be quite enough. So yeah, essentially, we explicitly account for the fact that like the network is going to be making mistakes, and these mistakes are going to propagate. But when the right inductive biases are introduced, the actual loss of performance, like the key part is the amount of performance you lose when I give you an input that's much bigger than the one you're training on. For classical neural networks, the performance collapses quite quickly. For these algorithm-inspired neural network architectures, the performance stays more or less robust, actually. You lose maybe 1 or 2 percentage points of accuracy, but no more. So like we're allowing ourselves to be a bit uncertain in our predictions, knowing that heuristics can still make use of this information. But yeah, but explicitly, like the whole point is in this concept of strong generalization. The size of the input doesn't really matter that much to the quality of the solution I'm going to get, which many traditional neural networks lack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that actually that brings us to your like part of research where I have said, okay, you are focused on the domain of graphs, and graph attention neural networks is actually something that you assembled, if I can say like that, in some sense. And what's specific about like your models, and if you can like share some of the insights about your inspiration there, and of course if you can find also some good examples where you already have used GNNs for some specific problems, I believe that will be really interesting for our participants to hear and to learn.
Yeah, I believe that this is a very important point. Thanks for asking this. I will split into two parts. So I will first try to motivate why are graph neural networks a meaningful thing for us to be doing. And then I'll actually give you like, it's so surprising that like right now there's so many very exciting applications of graph networks already out there that are being plugged into like real world systems and making actionable decisions. So first of all, graphs are a very generic structure for reasoning about the world, about concepts in the world and relations in the world, because it has this concept of different vertices that are linked together by edges. And that's it. Like a graph neural network is capable of reasoning over this kind of structure. And as I just described, you can usually model all of physics using just decomposed pairwise interactions. So it's quite powerful in that sense. And in a way, many kinds of data that nature gives you can be modeled as a graph. If you look at chemicals, for example, I can think of individual atoms in a molecule as individual nodes in a graph, and the bonds, the chemical bonds between them, as the links in the graph. And then I can run my graph neural network over this. And another argument for why graph neural networks are so powerful is check out what are the current dominant like models in deep learning. Things like convolutional neural nets or recurrent neural nets. They're specialized to work on grids, right? So 2D grids for images, 1D grids for text or speech. But all of those things are also graphs. You can just imagine each pixel of an image as a separate node in the graph, and I can connect it to the pixels that are closest to it. And this gives me a graph structure which is equivalent to the input image. So all of these specialized architectures like convolutional neural nets or recurrent neural nets can be modeled using the graph neural network framework. So it's a strictly more general sort of processing that is able to model most of the data that we get from nature. And not just nature, social networks, transportation networks, knowledge graphs that link different drugs to different treatments in biomedicine. All of these things can be expressed using graphs and hence modeled using graph neural networks. Now, for the actual applications, I think that one of the most interesting applications of graph neural networks that I've been seeing recently, and I don't think many people actually know that it's a graph neural network doing the work, is you might have seen a lot of headlines a few months ago about machine learning discovers novel potent antibiotic for the first time. So it's been all over many news outlets. Machine learning had been used to detect a novel antibiotic for the first time. What none of these outlets will tell you, and what actually most of the research paper won't tell you, it's actually hidden deep inside the research paper, is that the way in which this new antibiotic was discovered was they have trained a graph neural network to take a graph representation of a molecule and predict a property of the molecule, how likely it is to be potent against a certain bacteria or something like that. And obviously for some drugs, they had this information. There were actual laboratory tests performed that they can use as supervised learning data. But then what they've done is they've taken the trained model and ran it on a bunch of candidate drugs for which experiments had never been done. And then they've just taken the top 100 candidates, like out of these unseen drugs, which ones have given me the highest score based on my graph neural network. And then we sent those 100 drugs to clinicians, to like biochemists. And then they actually performed experiments and found that within that 100 drug candidates lies a gold mine of a completely new antibiotic that actually turns out to be quite potent against certain kinds of bacteria. So that's one application, a very straightforward application of graph neural networks, which already made its way on the headlines and like can make its way to actually novel pharmaceutical uses. One application that I saw recently that I found quite exciting is the usage of graph neural networks to detect fake news. So you can imagine posts on a social media platform as nodes in a graph, and you can say link them together if the same author has commented on two of them or something like that. And using this kind of analysis, combining like a node level textual analysis with a graph level propagation rule, you can actually infer more efficiently which posts here constitute fake news and should be moderated hence. And this was the foundation behind the Fabula AI startup that was recently actually acquired by Twitter. One more example that I would like to give actually is the example of recommender systems. So recommender systems look at the history of what you've liked, what you've purchased, and so on, and then give you a recommendation of what's the most likely thing that you're going to click on next, which can be quite useful, you know, in systems such as Pinterest, which actually deployed this technology directly. So it turns out that Pinterest was able to improve user satisfaction significantly by plugging in one of these large-scale giant graph neural networks in their recommender system. And there's actually a paper on the archive describing their system. I think it's quite cool. And yeah, they've been able to improve user satisfaction by using these graph neural networks over the existing like pairwise links of which users clicked on which posts to more accurately recommend what kinds of posts they should be looking at in the future. And I don't want to foreshadow a future question, but very recently, some of these graph mechanisms have been applied in the search for valid treatments against COVID-19, which I believe is a very topical and important thread. And I feel like graphs have a lot to offer there as well.
Yeah, actually, a startup that you have mentioned, they are actually using GNNs also for the sequencing like genes of COVID-19. And mutation to be able to understand like the mutation in shorter period of time. We have questions from a crowd, which is maybe also related to the segments actually that you are now discussing about. And actually, our participants is actually asking, when a child is learning about the world, it already has some evolutional knowledge back into its brain. But when we train some networks, it usually starts from random data. Do you think some generic starting configuration could make unsupervised learning possible at large scale? And do you see some connection in that sense with like already knowledge graphs in some sense that are inbuilt like in that child already maybe, I know, in starting point, if I can say like that?
So one way, I guess, people have completely different theories about how a truly intelligent system might be set up. But the way I like to see it is, as you mentioned, an ever expanding knowledge graph. And obviously we need to have a starting point. And as the question very rightfully points out, some of that initial knowledge is already baked into us through evolution and through like genetic mutations and so on. So I feel like, yes, it's going to be absolutely necessary to truly master the concept of memory in order to be able to do this kind of thing efficiently at large scale. And as we get better at modeling, say, different processes in the brain or something, we might come up with very good starting point inductive biases for these kinds of models. So I think I completely agree with the question of, we have to get really good at using memory, first of all, and then figure out what to put in this memory at the beginning of training in order to truly make this kind of progress. I would like to just quickly answer 2 questions that I've seen from the audience, because I know I can answer them quickly. There was a question of, is there a data set like ImageNet in the area of graph neural nets? And it's actually been released just recently. It's called the OGB, or Open Graph Benchmark, from Stanford University. It's an ongoing work in progress, but it seems to offer quite large scale graphs that people can be looking at, and there's an active leaderboard and everything like that. And in terms of recommending some books for graph neural networks, unfortunately, currently we don't have a comprehensive book on the graph neural networks area, but I am aware of at least a few developments in this direction. So I think we'll be starting to see a lot more interesting literature. In absence of books for graph neural networks, there's a lot of really interesting tutorials out there. For example, at machine learning conferences, there's been several tutorials by Will Hamilton, Jian Tang, Michael Bronstein, and so on, that you can all consider to like get a really quick up-to-speed view of the field.
And I will suggest also that people should actually take a look at your research paper that you have done with Professor Bengio and his team in Montreal. And that was for me really inspiring to see that, okay, young researcher, I would say, from this part of the world actually is creating such an impact in that research domain. And can you just share with us a couple of interesting stories around like the Mila AI and Professor Joshua Bengio related to your work and related to the graph neural networks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so obviously Mila in Montreal was the place where I first got into contact with graph neural networks and first started developing all of this in collaboration with Joshua and his team. And one thing that I found particularly like insightful about working with Joshua is that he really, like, contrary to most profs, I think they're like, when he truly gets excited about something, he likes to get his hands dirty and put them like in the action and like even directly contribute to the paper contents himself. So recently there's been some papers on the archive where he's actually been first author to kind of indicate how much he cares about that particular direction. And I also I really like the insights he gives. I feel like most profs out there tend to give really high level insights that might be useful for like, you know, thinking about the big picture and the future work. But I found that Joshua always was able to give like really insightful low level hints about why a certain mechanism is working. And well, I was, say, working in a team with 5 really talented researchers with like a track record of deep learning publications, and we were all puzzled by why a model was behaving, why our graph attention net model was behaving in a certain way. I raised the question with Joshua, and he spits out a reasonable answer within the scope of 2 minutes, and I just found that to be very incredible. But yeah, I feel like it's been a very dynamic, a very dynamic setting to work in.
And yeah, of course that we need to touch the questions around like your research and the environment where you are currently. You are part of DeepMind, organization that really inspire, I would say, all people who are currently like in AI machine learning world. Can you like share some like inspiration that might be interesting for people who would like to apply, and how to be able to apply some kind of tips for people maybe from this part of the world who are looking to join DeepMind? Is it really difficult to be part of it, etc.? Can you just shortly?
So I guess I would start off by saying that nowadays the gap between industrial research and academic research has really tightened. Nowadays, some of the top industrial AI labs seem to be doing business very much in a similar way to a research lab. So they care more about core research results rather than, direct applicability or something that can be, directly used in the short term. So I think in that sense, working at DeepMind feels a lot like doing a postdoc, in the sense that, so I finished the PhD and now I'm working towards, research directions that are of interest to me and pushing it together along with a team of like-minded people. And the way in which the whole place is organized feels a lot like a research group. So I feel like, having relevant, just generic research experience is something that prepares a person for a work at DeepMind, because I feel like while I will say that the interviews for DeepMind are reasonably challenging, most of them consist of the kinds of discussions and conversation that a researcher has to do on a daily basis anyway. So what I would say is generally trying to get as much, it's not a place that's, if you're going for a research scientist role, at least, it's not a place that's going to maximally value just one's engineering or problem solving skills. One should have a strong track record in research and know how to think like a researcher. And nowadays I feel like it's not that hard to get initial contacts with machine learning for people from our region if they're interested. Even within Belgrade, there is a huge thriving community of companies that offer AI positions or AI related jobs, and it's a good way to get initial AI exposure. And then moving on from there, taking up some aspects of research, trying to publish at a few workshops to start with, and moving to conferences. I feel like, something like that, as opposed to, of course, there's the traditional, career path of doing a research degree and then going for it. But I feel like, if you also want to take up a more engineering route, even nowadays, you can get access to research-like problems, even in most companies nowadays. So I guess that would be my advice.
Yeah, and probably, it's more, I would say, inspiring when you see that your research is actually also in a position where in short period it actually could be seen in some commercial application where, we know that there is a really strong connection, of course, between the Google and DeepMind in that sense. And probably that's something that inspires you as well.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like, there's also motivation coming from just the inherent drive to advance the knowledge of the things we're able to model using machine learning algorithms on one side, but then also trying to see directions and how they can be directly applicable to more concrete actionable areas of human life and industry is also quite motivating for me. And yeah, as I said, one of the things that got me excited most recently was when I saw this application of the graph attention net model within kind of a drug knowledge base, where you have drugs linked to each other if they interact or if they target certain proteins. And then as a result, they were able to come up with, using this architecture, they were able to come up with several new interesting drug candidates for treating COVID-19, which I thought was, for example, a very, very nice application that I definitely didn't have in mind when I initially came up with the model. So I feel like, that kind of breadth of application is a very important motivator for me as well.
Wow, that's really inspiring. Yeah, the situation currently is challenging all over the world, and we are trying to find solutions to solve this crisis. And yes, what we can see is that machine learning is used currently for solving these problems around us in a good manner. And definitely something that we need also to open, I would like to open this in our conversation, is a question about ethics and AI for social good in that sense. What are your thoughts? How we can create a more, I would say, efficient system that will be aligned with our character, with our culture? Do you see that as some kind of a general perspective where on the global level we need to find some ways how we will create it, or that's the question for each of the countries or cities or something like that?
So when it comes to ethics, I would say that we have to be very careful, first of all, because AI systems are already being deployed in places where we might not expect AI systems to be deployed, and they're making decisions that are inherently biased by the kind of training data that we give them. I will not need to give concrete examples. If you search for like bias in AI or some sort of discrimination that was propelled by AI, you can surely find a lot of examples where this was the case. And like, therefore, like, I don't think ethics is a problem that we can delegate to the future. I feel like it's a problem that's present right now, and decisions that we make right now about at least being very upfront about what our models are doing and what our models are latching onto. Or even, you know, even just having the honesty to say, look, our models are making these great decisions on our test set. We don't really have an idea why they're making these decisions at this point in time. And we're not sure that if you take us way out of distribution, they're still going to be able to make such good choices. I feel like even that is a very important first step, to be like honest and upfront to each other. But obviously, like, ideally, we will want to bake ethical concerns and like robustness and fairness directly inside the AI system. And I feel like we're currently in a unique position where a lot of these important ideas are just starting to become proposed. That if we are careful to develop ethical and fair AI in parallel with the amazing systems that achieve state-of-the-art performance, I feel like we really have a chance to create a system that will ultimately maybe even be more fair than we could be. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, we had the pool in parallel with your answer, where our participants said that actually 49% of them said that we have a chance to build our AI ethical standards before we create a more stronger AI. And I believe personally that this question is really important, because if we are looking from a technical point of view, like situation is really increasing, like productivity in the sense of like deploying new architecture, new models, etc., is like really, I know, boosting all over the place. Actually, last week I think that I saw that OpenAI announced some paper where they said that machine learning is actually outperforming the Moore law in efficiency of machine learning algorithms, where that means that we are actually faster in creating more efficient machine learning currently than if we are talking then let's say hardware support from that side. And that's really powerful. Like, things are really rapidly changing. We have a bunch of different kind of new environments, infrastructure. Companies are now paying attention to like data sets, structure of the data. But these kind of questions, are we going in the right direction in the sense of creating something that will be really aligned with our character, with our culture, with our behavior, is something that is pretty challenging. And this answer from our participants is also, I believe, motivating for me and for all of us here, where we can see that people believe that we should open the dialogue around this. And I strongly believe that communities are also important for actually opening that dialogue. And communities, especially ones that are like collecting and gathering the people who are in the domain, who really know or who are deeper than others in this problem, are really important. And that's actually the reason why we started with one news story, which is called Serbian AI Society, where Petar, yes, you are one of the really most inspiring board members of our society. Our goal with that is actually to open the dialogue, to try to motivate people, not only to talk around like technical stuff, but also to open these really specific questions where we do not have some kind of a proper answer. I believe it's more like a discussion around us to try to find something that will be like, I know, a bridge between some elements. And I believe that will be one of the most difficult questions or answers that we should have in the next couple of years. What was your motivation for joining Serbian AI Society?
Good question. Okay, so first of all, I would like to say that I feel like, you know, a lot of the engineering and like research positions I was able to get throughout my career was like primarily propelled by the foundational education I got in Serbia. So I feel like the kind of knowledge I was able to get there was super beneficial towards everything that I did after that. And in a way, it only felt really natural to like try to contribute back perhaps some of this knowledge that or experience at least that I've gained like when working at different institutes. So in that sense, like advancing the AI ecosystem is something in Serbia, something that I'm very passionate about. And I'm hopeful that at some point, you know, the AI ecosystem will be at such a point where the top AI researchers from Serbia and the region will not have to end up working somewhere else in order to work on, you know, groundbreaking research, for example, and have the resources to be able to do something like this. So that's one of the main motivations. But another thing is the thing that you mentioned about how to properly tackle some topics like ethics. We need a diversity of views. We need a diversity of opinions. A lot of people that are in machine learning nowadays have come from a very, well, not necessarily narrow, but a very predictable career path in the sense that they've done some work in mathematics or science or computer science or statistics, and then they went from there to do a PhD, and now they're performing machine learning research. And I feel like when you look at things only from one particular perspective, you will think of it as a problem that needs to be solved, and you will think of it as an input to output mapping, and you won't you won't necessarily see the big picture or see how it might affect somebody else. And that's why we need people who came from different areas of science. We need people who came from social sciences. We need people who have even experience with public policy to be able to give us that perspective on how what we do is going to affect everybody else around us. And like, as a result, like, you know, I feel like a society like this is a way to gather all of those interest groups in Serbia, because AI is going to affect us all. It is up to us whether we choose to ignore it or embrace it. And I feel like we can get much further if we like embrace the different views on the matter, both the skeptical and the hype and everything in between, and just working together to find the best possible solution.
Lovely said. And yeah, the goal of this organization is not only like to gather people in Serbia. Yes, that's one of the main elements, but we have bunch of people like you all over the world who are like coming from Cambridge, MIT, Boston, Stanford, etc. Really inspiring organization that are also really motivated to participate and to help like in creation of more productive AI research community that will be able to communicate better like with all the organization here in Serbia, like faculties, universities, institutions that are supporting these kind of things. And not only, as I said, from the technical point of view, where we should only discuss about like algorithmic things, etc. But also, as you said, we would like to also to gather people who are like from the side of the social sciences, people who are like philosophers, sociologists, lawyers, etc. People who will be able to contribute in that open dialogue around like a future society and ways how we will create it. And I need to say that one of the most inspiring also communities in the sense of research is also Mila, where you had the chance to be part of it in your research activities, and that's something similar to things what we would like to have here in that sense. Do you think that's possible? Do you think that's possible for us to have in some sense?
So what I think, one thing that I would like to notice is that I have kept my contacts within Serbia, and I still try to collaborate with some research groups at the University of Belgrade, for example. And what I find often is amazing enthusiasm. Like I find people who are truly willing to overcome all the obstacles that get in their way, like the fact that they don't necessarily have access to most reliable resources, or their jobs fail every 5 hours or so, and they have to, like, you know, a life's worth of experiments ends up going stale and they have to rerun the whole thing all over again. I think that, like, even in the face of potential challenges that the environment gives them, they have amazing enthusiasm and drive and passion for like driving research, even in the limited circumstances that they have. And some of the ideas that they're coming up with are truly remarkable. So I feel like talent, even talent which stayed in the country, we have a lot of such talent. And I feel like being able to foster such talent in one place, give them a common platform as something to expand from, is one way in which we can actually simulate many aspects of how Mila came to be within the Serbian ecosystem. I mean, in fact, Mila started out as a single research group of Joshua Bengios at the Université de Montréal, and it kind of grew from there over the many years to encapsulate everything that was around it and actually perform super, super insightful stuff. So I feel like, we have enthusiasm, we have the right kind of people, we just have to get them together and we have to point them in the right direction. I think that's what this society can be all about, facilitating.
We have a question actually from one of our members, AI Minds in Serbian AI Society, Dejan, hello. And he asked actually, how would you compare academic community in Serbia and academic community in other developed countries? What lacks and how we can improve it?
Mm. Yeah, this is a very good question. So what I would say, looking at, say, the content that's covered in an undergraduate course, like comparing Cambridge to like the University of Belgrade, I don't think that there is a massive difference in the content that we cover. I think that actually, say, when it comes to machine learning, we might even be ahead. Like in Serbia, we might even be ahead of Cambridge in some aspects. But the thing that stands out in the way things are organized, for example, here in the UK, is that there is a lot more there's a lot more emphasis on close teaching, so teaching within small groups that meet regularly and directly discuss the material, rather than a lecture that just gives you a bunch of material and then asks you to go over it sometime in the future. And there's a lot of like emphasis on researching by yourself, on discovering new things. So in Cambridge, they never teach you, like in the main computer science course at Cambridge at least, they never teach you about TensorFlow, they never teach you about these state-of-the-art deep learning systems, but they give you the foundational material that you can adapt to such new technologies, and then they encourage you to come looking for answers by yourself. And it still works. Like, even if the content isn't as most up to date, you're still like, you have a lot of this close communication with people who are experts in the field, and they have 1 hour that they're dedicating to you every week, and like this is how you can advance your knowledge. And yeah, like it's not that much of an emphasis on regurgitating information. It's a lot more about researching by yourself and coming up with your own conclusions. And I feel like if we have a little bit more freedom within our own academic system, we could very much catch up or even be ahead of some of the Western university models.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I also need to add that attention also in your architecture that you have is something that's maybe a missing block here, in the sense where we need people who will be able to narrow and to focus in some segments, our people, not on like a micromanagement level, more on like a inspirational level where they will have a full support, and where those talented people will have a channel, they will have a path to find the persons like you, find like a mentors who will be able to help them with their like roadmap and next like investigations. And I find it really important, and actually that's something where we are now investing heavily from our side, if we are talking about like a society, in a sense how we could support that. Because like big countries, they have some kind of a systematic approach where there is a path for a youngster to go to MIT, to go to Stanford, etc. It's not only a question like are you good with your grades, etc. It's more like a systematical approach where you have like a scheme where that works. And I believe that this kind of network that we are creating, we will be able to create something really powerful for our like community, like our students, where they will be able also to find the proper mentors abroad, and then as you to find a way how to also push their knowledge, their experience into the community, here in this place. And yeah, I find it really amazing, and we are so motivated to push even more. And I think that we are pretty close actually to the end of this first chapter, first event in series of presentation that we will have with this event, as we call it, like Talking Minds. And I have a really interesting and probably most difficult question for our participants. where I will start like launching this pooling. And the question is, yeah, what's inspiring for them? Do you believe that we will be able to create a human level intelligence in this decade or like in next like century or not? Short answer from you, Petar. What do you think?
I would say that, well, it really depends on how you define it. If human level intelligence means being able to reason entirely like a human, I would argue that that's actually not very useful. Like, if we're building a system that's going to have exactly the same reasoning capabilities as a human, then why not just use humans? Like, let's just say that. Like, ideally, we want to be able to achieve superhuman kind of performance in certain domains where humans may not be able to think as fast or as adaptively, where neural nets can detect like really tiny patterns in the data. So the reality of the question of whether, say, computers are able to think is about as relevant as the question of whether submarines can swim. It's not true that when people were designing submarines, they were looking at fish and asking how exactly do fish pull this thing off. They were in fact trying to solve a completely different problem. The fact that they came up copying some of the ideas from what a fish does is, incidental. In the same way, we shouldn't be trying to copy what every single neuron in the human brain in terms of intelligence is doing. We should be looking at human behavior and looking at results from neuroscience and seeing which of these results about how humans connect the dots together help us make our AI systems connect the dots better. And at that point, we'll be able to be superhuman in those tiny important domains where AI can truly help the human. So that would be like my answer to that particular question.
Do you believe in superheroes?
In superheroes?
In that sense of creating like superhumans?
So I don't believe in creating a single superhuman. I believe in systems that are engineered to help us perform a certain kind of computation more efficiently than a human could do. So I feel like, AI will ultimately be an aid to a human rather than something that's going to replace a human. And the moment we start talking about replacing people, I think we're sort of losing the humanity from the whole picture. So.
Petar, what to say? This is really motivating. I see here lots of motivation from our chat here. I think, that we open a really great discussion around the AI, and I probably have tons of questions to ask you. But for now, I think, we should keep further with our own activities that we have currently with the Serbian AI Society in that sense, and other activities that are helping in flourishing this ecosystem in a better way, to find the ways how we will actually scale it to be more, I would say, influencing on a global level. And what I wanted to say is thank you for actually being with us here into our organization, also on this event. And I hope really that I will be able to host you again, and maybe with more insights about our internal results that we have with Serbian AI Society, and maybe more students that because of your talk today will be motivated to apply for Cambridge, to apply for DeepMind and other inspiring organizations all around the world. Petar, thank you so much, and talk to you soon then.
So Jovan, thank you so much for inviting me. And I would just like to say that I know that there's been a lot of really interesting and insightful questions we didn't manage to answer today. Hi, Kenneth, by the way. Very nice to see you here. But I am very happy to further discuss any aspects of what we discussed here. So if you're interested, you can contact me via Twitter, petarv_93, or on LinkedIn, and I'd be very happy to discuss further with you on any of the topics that you're interested in here. Thank you so much, Owen, for the wonderful opportunity, and thank you all.
Thank you all. See you soon then. Bye.